today's session is all about designing good API experiences. And this is a webinar, and we want you to take this session and kind of just take this time to learn and get inspired about what it means to design good APIs. We'll be sharing some interesting resources as we go along the way. And I hope this session kind of gives you a better understanding of everything that goes into and things that you should think about when it comes to designing APIs. So I wanted to take this time to introduce myself. So my name is Pooja Mistry. I am a developer advocate here at Postman. And I'm so excited to be sharing this session. I've worked with Postman quite a bit, and I've worked to, share all the information and share with others all of the interesting capabilities that Postman have to offer. And I'm here, and I'm joined with such a wonderful leader in the API governance space, Arnaud. And I'll let Arnaud introduce himself as well.
Yeah. So hello everyone. Bonjour. I'm Arnaud. I'm API governance lead at Postman, and I'm particularly interested in API governance, but mainly from the design perspective today. And I'm also the author of a book, which is titled The Design of Web APIs, and it's obviously about the design of web APIs.
I wanted to take this time to talk to you a little bit about today's agenda. So today we're going to be talking about basically what goes into designing APIs. How can we design APIs? Then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the importance of the good API design experience. We're going to talk about better practices when it comes to designing and usual concerns. And we're going to we have a wonderful demo that's highly focused on error handling and designing through specific aspects. And then finally, we'll be sharing some resources with you all, and we'll be answering your questions. So I just wanted to reiterate, as you have questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A tab on the bottom. And at the end of the session, we will pick out a couple of questions that we find interesting, and we'll answer them live as well. So the learning objectives of today, ideally, maybe after the session, we would love for you to kind of get the idea of being able to determine what kind of business needs you would need when it comes to designing your APIs, and then understand design principles, whether that's working with other specific usual concerns or error practices, especially for REST APIs. And then finally, we'll be showing you how to work with Postman and the process of setting up your workspace, creating documentation, and ultimately publishing your API once you've designed it. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So now that we've talked both about your goals and your learning objectives, let's talk about what it means to design APIs. And ultimately, when you're thinking about what it means to design your APIs, you're trying to answer this question, which is, what is the problem your API is trying to solve? And are you designing your API in the right way? So we talk about the 8 traits of effective API design, API first design, and I'm going to let Arnaud kind of talk about some of these traits.
Yeah, thank you, Pooja. So maybe a little explanation about what means API first. API first is a strategy that involves leveraging APIs as building blocks, and that will help you to create solutions, products, faster, and will help you save time and money, and in the end, eventually, generate more value. The design of APIs can contribute to an API-first strategies by having those 8 traits. The first one, which is probably the most important, is alignment with the organization's goals. And when Pooja was asking what problem is your API trying to solve, that problem must answer a question that is important for your organization. Because if you are not doing that, you are creating an API that will serve no one. The second important thing when you are creating and designing an API, it's thinking about reusability. Because if you are doing an API first strategy, you need reusable building blocks. But even without that, when you create an API, if it's only used by one consumer, most of the time it's not really a good idea to create it, because you will lose time reinventing the wheel again and again, creating specific APIs for each problem you are trying to solve. Another concern regarding API design and API first in general is interoperability. Behind that concept, it's the idea of using the adapted data and data format that will be understood by the most systems and people possible. At worst, you will, for instance, use data like identifiers that are locally known. If all of your APIs use, for instance, the same type of ID to identify, let's say, customers, that will be easier to use them as a whole and create solutions based on those different APIs. And if you want to talk with the outside world, you should also leverage standards like ISO codes or specific data formats that will be usable by anyone who is not aware of how your domain or system works. Another important topic, they're all important, but is the ability to evolve. Because when you are designing an API, you will make design decisions, and depending on which you do, the API you are creating will be more or less easy or more or less complicated to evolve. The next topic, and that's why we're here today, is about user friendliness. If you are creating the right API that is actually solving a real problem, it's the beginning of being user friendly with your API. But even when you know what you are doing, you need to do that in a really user friendly manner, choosing the right data types, choosing the names that will make sense for anyone, and so on. Security is a topic for anyone creating APIs or creating software in general, obviously. So you really have to be careful about that topic. And that is a topic that also is a concern during design. We will not talk about it today, but no, that is a concern. Efficiency is also a concern for API in general, in a sense how your API call will perform, how the system behind them will perform, will be able to scale. But even during design, you can make decisions that will impact those performance. And last but not least, when you design APIs, you have to be pragmatic, because sometimes the ideal solution will be too complex, too long to implement. And the ideal design could lead to such a situation. So in that case, you have to say, okay, we will do a less than ideal design and create a less than ideal solution. But with that, we will be able to, based on the budget we have and the time we have, we will be able to do what we need to do. And that's really important. Never be so strict on what is an idealistic solution that you are always unable to deliver something.
Thanks, Arnaud. And I know that Arnaud has written an amazing blog on exactly this topic, and I believe I've shared that in the chat. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more into what exactly API first design is, and API and the 8 traits a little bit more, feel free to take a look at that blog that I have linked in the chat. And then finally, I think once we've talked about these 8 traits of API design, I think the best thing that we need to talk about next is the impact of the API experience. So there are many different types of APIs that can be designed depending on their use case. Public APIs that are publicly available to anyone in the world to consume. There's partner APIs that are exposed only to strategic business partners, and they're not available for everyone's needs. And then finally, there's private APIs that are hidden outside of your organization to everyone, that are hidden to everyone outside of your organization and are specifically internal to your company's needs. And so these have a completely different design elements as well. So I wanted to take this time to also talk about the benefits of both the good API experience as well as the bad API experience and why that matters. So Arnaud, let's talk about both the good and the bad of when it comes to APIs.
So, the first thing about that topic, which is really important, is whatever the type of API you are talking about, private, partner or public, the experience is important. And because if you are, and we start with the bad experience, if you are creating APIs, and especially private APIs, but provide a bad experience, it will take a long time for any integration. And that means developers, your colleagues, will lose time trying to use your API. And the company will lose money because these developers are spending too much time on something which is not supposed to take so long. And so then it will cost to the company. You may miss important milestone. And so another problem of value non-generated for a company. So that's really a huge problem. And mainly for private APIs, the bad experience will lead to a very bad and decreased productivity. And obviously, if people can choose to use your API, if it provides a terrible experience, nobody will use it. And so public APIs and partner APIs will just generate no money. Mm-hmm. If you succeed to create a good API experience, you will obviously avoid all that. You will have developers who will be able to integrate your API in their application in a breeze, in no time, without having to think, without having to ask you how it is working. So you will also don't spend your time on support. And the time to value for any of your API will be really shortened. And also, if you are doing things well, you will lessen the risk of introducing breaking change, and so annoy everyone and possibly break critical application in productions.
Right. And I feel like today we're going to see some of these in action as we talk about some of the major concerns, especially I think today what we're going to be talking about are especially handling errors. So today our whole session is around better practices, especially around these six aspects of API design: naming, data modeling, required, not required, error handling, and we'll be talking about documentation, and finally consistency. So, but before we dive into that, I wanted to share with you all how to kind of work with Postman as a tool when it comes to designing your APIs. And we're going to be showing you basically a workspace, and this is going to be a place where you can work to not only test your APIs, but also design. So for those of you who might be aware, you might be aware of the public of your API Postman workspace. And if you're interested in creating a workspace, you can create either public workspaces that are available to everyone, team workspaces, or you could create private workspaces, which are sandboxes for you to use. So this is the Postman Intergalactic public workspace, and I'll be sharing this link out to everybody. These have collections where, if those of you are familiar with Postman, this is where you can do all of your testing and scripting. And then we also have the API tabs where you can actually create APIs, create new APIs by clicking on create new APIs. And then you can go through the whole process of API design on the API tab, and then the whole testing process on the collections tab. And today we're going to be working specifically with this coffee brewing collection and its associated API, which is coffee brewing. I'm going to be sharing this link out in the chat with everyone. So for those of you who are interested and want to play around with the things that we've shared in this session, you can go ahead and create a fork into your own collection, into your own workspace, and start playing around with it that way. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Arnaud, and we're going to get started in about showing you a demo of what we mean about the API design experience.
Okay, so let me share my screen. Perfect. So you should be able to see my screen. I hope it's the Zoom is enough for everyone. Let us know if that's not the case. Okay, so we will, I'm struggling with my mouse. We will design a coffee brewing API. So one important thing you may not be aware of is that today we will design a REST API. So we'll possibly talk about get/this, get/that, designing data models. But before diving into that, you have to do some prior work regarding what problem you are trying to solve and how you will solve it, all that using natural language. Because if you don't know, if you don't have a clear understanding of the problem and how to solve it, you will not be able to design your API. So to do so, I usually use something that is that I put in my book, which is called the API Goals Canva. But the idea is to identify all the users, all the use case they need to fulfill, and decompose them in series of steps. And all these steps will become operations in your API. That's where you will know exactly what you need to know. And you can have that discussion with the people who are experts of the domain you are dealing with. And they don't need to be experts in API design because that's your job. So today we will talk about brewing coffee. We will work on a very short use case, which is get a coffee, and which is composed of two steps: choose coffee beans and brew coffee. So we will design two operations, one to choose coffee beans and another one to brew coffee. Naming is hard, and unfortunately, you will have to name many things when you design APIs. And the first name you need to choose is the name of your API. So I choose to name this API Coffee Brewing. I've made hundreds, if not thousands, of API design reviews before joining Postman, so helping people design APIs. And many times I have seen APIs just named API. Mm-hmm. The problem with an API which is just named API is that when you see that name, you don't know what you can do with it. And if in your organization you have many APIs, it will be quite complicated. So that's really important. Another thing regarding naming, and that works for naming an API, naming a data model, naming an operation, it will set the boundaries of the elements. In a sense, if I name it API, I could be tempted to put any kind of operation in there. Operation linked to coffee brewing, but also to tea, to making pastries or whatsoever. But if I say, hey, this is the coffee brewing API, okay, I will just put in there things related to coffee brewing and not anything else. Okay, let's start out our first operation. So what you see here is a very basic OpenAPI document. I will not dive in this topic today, but know that it's a format that you can use to formally describe your APIs with a machine-readable and almost human-readable language. So I just added, yes, the operation. So reminder, the first use case we want to fulfill, the first step we want to fulfill is choose coffee beans. So to choose coffee beans, a user will generally search some beans, coffee beans, in a list of beans. And if you're not, you don't need to see that. If you're not familiar with REST API, representing search bean in a REST API is not that obvious. So in REST, the principle is to leverage the HTTP protocol and take an operation like get product or search beans and turn it into something that is compatible with the HTTP protocol. And to do so, we need to identify an action and a resource which is a functional concept or a business concept. So in our case, we are looking for beans. We are searching beans. So the business concept we are working with is beans. And the action we are doing on those beans is search. Mm-hmm. So search is a kind of read operation. So in the HTTP protocol, you will use the HTTP GET method. What is interesting? Yeah, yes, Pooja.
Yeah, so I think in this case, the one question is like what you might be returning. So if you're returning a single data versus multiple data, how would you go about naming that?
Yeah. And so if we are returning, and that's what we have in this example, we are returning a list of beans, we will use /beans. There is the team which would say, oh, a list of bean is /bean, that way. But if I want to return only a single bean, I will most usually do things like this. Some people may do things like this. Or this. From a pure HTTP perspective, they are all okay, because these are unique URLs that identify the things you are working with. But then comes understandability, and usability. And also a pure question of stylistic choices. So personally, I prefer to represent any resource that is a list with a plural noun. But some people prefer a singular. If that is the case, they have to use singular at every level. In a sense, if a list of bean, if a single bean is /bean ID, a list of beans should be /bean and not /beans, because if you use the same name at each level, people can guess how your API works. Because if I see /beans, I know, oh, there are beans. So maybe I can add a bean ID afterward. And making people able to guess how your API work is one of the best tips I can give you today, because you feel smart when that happens. Did you ever have that feeling when you are using something for the first time? You understand how everything works. You can guess everything without having to read the instruction manual, and you feel great. And so you are happy with that. And so anytime you design your API, you have to work on that.
Sounds good. Joyce is saying ChatGPT.
Yeah, you can ask ChatGPT to design your API.
Yes.
That works. The result may not be that good, but that's a good start. Okay, I'm just checking the time. Yeah, so we have that operation search beans, which returns beans. And it returns those beans. Maybe I can show you an example. Someone was asking about, hey, should I provide example in my API documentation? The answer is yes. Because if you don't, people don't see how your API works. And also those examples can be used to generate mock. Yeah, so when we are returning those beans, we're not returning directly a list, but an object that contains an element that is a list. That's important to avoid later introducing breaking change because you want to add metadata near your list. For instance, you want to manage pagination or add any other information which is related to the list, but you cannot put in the list. And so that's also a good way to create a good experience by making the right decision. So later, you will not have to make terrible decisions that will annoy every existing user of your API.
Right. So here you're returning a list of objects, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we can see that here, beans, it's, big data, an array of objects. Oh, there is one thing which is not defined here, and I think I can see it there. Yeah, so when you design your API, you have to choose name, you have to choose data types. Regarding choosing names, there is something that you may not have seen. But where is it? Oh, it's not there. Yeah, see. Here, description is not camel cased. So that's a typical typo mistake that will happen a lot when you are designing API, and especially if you are designing API with other colleagues. You don't have the same view. Should we use camel case, Pascal case, spinel case? There is no good solution. Just choose one, stick to it, And if you can use linters to check that your API is actually has all properties in camel case, do that. We can do that in Postman. But here I would like to talk about price. So when you are returning beans, we are returning a price which is not yet defined. And Pooja, I would like to have your advice on that. What kind of data should we return in that price?
Right. Yeah. So since we want to return some sort of amount, we could probably create that as like a data type for number as one of them. So, or integer, but I feel like number might be a little bit better since it has you can use floating numbers, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
But with price, depending on where you are buying this coffee, whether that's in the United States or buying it in Europe, we might also need to think about currency as well.
Yes, I'm French, so I'm using euros and not dollars.
Mm-hmm. So in this case, it seems like something that would need multiple properties, correct?
Yeah. So it would be an object, and it would contain the value, which is the number, and then the currency, which is what?
So we can use like ISO currency values.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good answer. So ISO currency codes, and more precisely, ISO 4217 currency codes. For those who don't know what are currency codes, let me show you ISO currency codes. And so they look like this: 3 letters, and anyone in the world will be able to understand that you are sending something in euro, British pounds, dollars. Remember when I was talking about interoperability, that's hard for me to say. That's it. Right. That way your data is understandable by anyone.
Right. Okay. So this is interesting because price can now hold 2 different types in an object.
Yeah. And so if we look there in the documentation, I said if we look there in the documentation, that's the demo effect. Yes. The price is an object with a value and a number, which is an ISO 4217 currency code. Okay. So that's what I wanted to show on this AP, on this operation. Just one last thing, which is not shown here. The data here is a list. So we are returning a list of beans. It's really important to explicitly tell what is the size of your list, because that way people will know, okay, at maximum I will have, I don't know how many beans. So you can do that using min items and max items 100. And typically when I was talking about, hey, later we can add pagination, you don't add pagination later, you put it right from the start. It's better for everyone. And that way you can say, hey, I'm returning data in pages that size 100 elements. Let's move on to the next operation and the next step in our use case, brewing coffee.
So just to summarize here, what operation here we created is a get operation, correct?
Yes.
Which we called beans. So this operation is going to get the different types of beans that we are going to use to brew our coffee, correct?
Exactly. So that was the first step, and that will help us to fulfill the need, choosing coffee beans.
Right.
And now we move on to the next operation. We need to brew a coffee. On that part, there are, I think, 2 important topics. The first one is, just like for previous operation, we need to represent brewing a coffee with some HTTP stuff. And for beginners, when they start to design REST API, if they work with customers, products, beans, they see how to represent that in HTTP, because to choose the path, because the path is representing something that means something. But brewing a coffee, it's more like a process than a thing. So to represent that, I choose to use the path /brewings. But I could have another option to represent that process of brewing a coffee. I could have say /coffees, because what interests me is the result of the process, coffees. And so I will create a coffee by using the HTTP post method. So when you are facing this use case of, I have to represent a process with a resource, you have two options. You can use the result of the process to name your resource, or you can use the process itself. In that case, I choose to use the process because brewing a coffee may take some time, a few seconds, a few minutes. And if I want to monitor how the brewing goes with the brewing resource /brewings, I'm able to do that. But if I'm talking directly about coffees, that will not work. So to brew a coffee, we need 3 elements: bean, and those beans are the one coming from previous operation. And so in the documentation, we explain, if you don't know which bean you can choose, take a look at the search bean operations. So that's important, again, to provide a good experience, to explain not only, okay, here are all the operations of my API, these are ingredients, but I will not explain you the recipes, how to use all those ingredients to do something which is interesting for you. And so that way I can explain, before that, you have to use this other operation if you want. But if you already know which beans you want to use, that's okay. We also need milk and the level of roasting. I'm not a coffee drinker. I don't know if you take milk in your coffee, Pooja?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I like to drink my coffee black. So in that case, would I always have to specify a milk type when I'm using this API?
Actually, in the current state of the description of our API, you can start to brew a coffee without providing any information.
Okay.
Because all these information are not marked as required.
Okay.
So they're optional by default. So we need to state what is actually mandatory to brew a coffee. And indeed, we don't need milk to brew a coffee. Do we need to roast, to know the roast type to brew a coffee?
Well, it seems like right now the roast type will be just any default, or I don't even need to set a roast type, correct?
Maybe. So let's see what I choose to do with the correct definition of this API. Brew a coffee. And so what is happening now? Yeah. So I've modified the API I didn't type everything, I just copy pasting stuff because otherwise it would take ages. So the only thing we need to brew a coffee is the bean, because regarding the milk, as you said, there are some people who like to drink their coffee black. And regarding the roast type, I could have said, yes, roast is optional. And I could have defined, using the OpenAPI specification, a default value for roast. But I didn't. I didn't because depending, and I'm not a coffee expert, I just discovered that while preparing this session, but I discovered that depending on the type of bean you choose, there is a recommended roast level. So it's the job of the implementation to choose the adapted roast level. What is important here regarding this required topic is that the less you require information, the better. Because that way, I'm not looking at the right place, that way people will be able to use an operation faster. If you request hundreds of information, it will take a longer time to actually do something.
Right.
And when people use API, they need to do something quickly just to discover how it works.
Right. And this reduces that time to first call, correct?
Yeah, time to first call, time to value, exactly.
Mm-hmm. And that's what we were getting here. So just to summarize, as people are following along, I know there's some questions in the chat as well. Ideally here, we're trying to kind of design two different types of APIs. One where you are searching and, we talked about the properties of naming. We talked about also price, and those properties. And now we're going into a post operation here where we're talking about the process of creating a coffee with some data that we've already created. So I think we've touched on being able to require and things like that. Before, I noticed we have a little bit of time, Arnaud. I'm wondering if it makes sense for us to just answer a question in the middle.
Yeah, I've seen some interesting question. And just to finish on the required side, so we have talked about required from the sending information side, but know that when you are returning information, you can state, so using OpenAPI or any other format usually, it's interesting to state what will always be returned and what may be null or undefined, because that way the consumer will know exactly on what they can rely on.
Right.
That's really important, because most of the time people are aware of, I need to state exactly what is required because I will need it in my implementation. But when I'm returning data, I don't use them, so I don't care about what is happening on the other side. That's the typical attitude that you shouldn't have when you are designing API, because you have to care about the experience of the people who will use it. So regarding the questions, I'm scanning them. Yes. First one, the bean ID when you want to brew coffee is mandatory. And so I'm sorry if I don't tell your name correctly, but Gauri Shankar asked, since bean ID is mandatory, can we keep it as a path parameter? So in a sense, it would be /brewings/bean ID. No, because we are creating a brewing process. And when you are creating something, you always work on the resource that represents the list of elements where you will add something. /brewings/bean ID actually does not represent anything because from the usual experience I have with any type of API, after /brewings, if I see an ID, I expect to see the ID of a brewing that has started or that is already finished. So it's important to not use the path as a kind of stack where you will put any parameters. I have a post on the topic. We will share it later, but really be careful. Always use the path as a hierarchy, and each level of the hierarchy must make sense regarding the hierarchy itself and must make sense for the users. Other question, maybe Pooja, if you have seen question that you
I think the one interesting question I think we got, I think it's from Stephen, is when we were talking about our last API, is why do we use data versus beans in a returned list?
Oh, yeah. So that's actually, I'm usually not using data, but items, which is a generic name. So the question is regarding when you are returning a list within an object, the name of the property that holds the list. Should it be something generic, like data or items, or something specific? I've seen API using both. I personally prefer to use generic names whenever possible. That way, if I get a list of beans, a list of brewings, or a list of puppies, they will always be in the data or in the item stuff. If I'm using specific names, I will have to think, okay, it's a list of puppies, so I have to look in puppies. And the same goes for ID. The bean ID. which is, so in the bean object, I have the unique identifier named ID. I could name it bean ID. It's the same rationale. I prefer to use generic names because that way, whatever I'm looking at, a bean or a puppy, I know that ID is its unique identifier. And that way, I feel smart. And it's not a big deal here because there's only one ID. But imagine if there is the producer ID and the bean ID. If you just look at the data you have and you don't know what it is, it will be complicated to decide which ID to use. But there are pros and cons. What is really important is to choose one way to do things, using generic names or specific names, and stick to it. Because if you do things randomly, people will have really hard time to understand and to call to your APIs.
Sounds great. I think just to keep a little bit info on time, I think that we can now move towards the process of testing these APIs, correct?
Yeah, and especially talk about errors, because now we have talked about the API path. Everything is working well, but what is happening if people do not provide bean ID or provide a wrong value for milk, for instance? So to do so, I will demonstrate, and I'm seeing that again. What happens and when we fail to brew a coffee? So I will not spoil you, and Pooja, do not spoil the audience. There are two mistakes in this request. So what you see here, so we are in a collection. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about collection, Pooja?
Yeah. So right now, so where we were designing the coffee brewing was in the APIs tab, where we were able to work with the definitions file, right? Here we're actually on the collections tab, where we're able to now test out each of those requests that we've currently designed. So the way the collections work is that you can organize them. Here we've organized them by operations. So the search operation, which is getting the beans that we designed, and then also the brewing the coffee, which is another operation that we designed. And then we also have a folder for all of the use cases. So this is something you want to think about as you organize while you're testing this. But just before we show them how this works, do you all want to type in the chat what you think is the issue with this particular? Do you want to do that, Arnaud?
Yeah. Maybe right. I can start to try to send a request. Yeah, someone has spotted one of the problem. Bean is misspelled. Okay, and there is another issue. All
right. So I like that everyone is kind of trying to see what the error might be when it comes to working.
So I tried to send my request, but without choosing the coffee machine I was targeting. So this error that you see here comes from a collection prescript here that checks that I'm selecting an environment before firing my request, because I always forget to do that. And so that's why I have those kind of scripts in all my collections. So no coffee machine has been selected. So let's select one. The first one, which is the dumb coffee machine. What says the dumb coffee machine? The dumb coffee machine says bad request. How could that look like in a user interface? Let's say a mobile application or website, which is actually using that API. It would look like this. In a sense, it says it's green. That means it's working. Yes. Coffee is brewing, but bad request. Why does my UI says that? Do you know that? Why, Pooja?
I have a feeling why, but I think as a user, I would find this so confusing. I would say it's giving me a 200, so I would expect that it is working, but it's not working.
Exactly. We're returning a 200 HTTP status code. And so my application, which perfectly understands HTTP, says, oh, my request was okay. So now I can show the result to the user, which is bad request. So that's not good. Don't do that at home. And someone says the HTTP code should be 400 bad requests. So let's see what says the less dumb coffee machine. Oh, the less dumb coffee machine, we have a better result in our application because we know that coffee is not brewing because we had a 400 bad request. And just to show you what is the actual result, there is nothing in the response body. We just have the 400 bad request. But at least we are speaking HTTP correctly, and we know, oh, 400 means the consumer has made a mistake.
Right.
Know that HTTP status code are classified by classes. 200 whatever means, yes, it works. 400 whatever means, consumer, you have a problem in your request. And 500 means, oops, hello, I'm the implementation and I have an unexpected problem. So let's move on to a human-friendly coffee machine. The human-friendly coffee machine still returns a 400 bad request with a message which said bean, and I made a mistake. I did not updated my API because it's not bean, but bean ID according to my API definition. But nobody, no problem. You don't see that. Still, I have a better feedback for the end user because, oh, bean is required. It's not actually the end user I'm talking to, but to the developer who's developing that application. Coffee is not brewing because bean is required. You said bean ID. Let's see another machine, which is more machine friendly. And let me show you. We do it that way. Now, I know that the bean or bean ID property is missing because bean ID is required. What I return now is not just a string. And by the way, just returning a string in our API response must never be done because it's not extensible. If you want to add data later, you can't. So we have the same human-friendly message as before, but now we have more information about the error, which says, oh, it's an error of type required. In a sense, you did not send a required property. And actually, this property is named bean. It's in the body, and its location in the body is that. What you see here is a JSON pointer. It's a standardized way of describing a path in a JSON object. So the implementation is expected to receive a body that contains a bean property at its root. And so in the visualization, we are able to code, oh, I have something that is missing. But we can do more than that because there is not one single issue in our request. And so the awesome coffee machine tells us everything what is wrong in our request. So let me show you the return. So now we have a list of errors. So as you can see, I'm a little bit inconsistent with myself. I'm returning a list and it's not named data. I do that on purpose because that way I can return data and errors in the same response if that is needed. It's not really beautiful. But still, I have a list of errors. One says bean is required, so that was the first error we had before, but we also have information regarding the Ben stuff, so the bean with the typo. We don't need Ben to brew coffee, and we know exactly where it is. And also, there is a problem with the milk, because I sent écrémé, which is light in French. And for this error, we are not only telling what is wrong, but we are also explaining how to fix that by providing the possible value. And so what is important? And so I'm able to build the visualization. So all you see here is built thanks to some JavaScript code, which is there. I have a template leveraging data coming from the request, the response, with a little bit of bootstrap stuff. But still, you have interesting data. And so you can see how the developer, but also how the end user could feel based on the different level of response. Because imagine you are creating a form for, let's say, a loan. You want to buy a house. So you have to give many information. And if many of them are wrong, imagine how the user, the end user, will feel by having a message says, oh, information 1 is wrong. Information, and I modify. Information 2 is wrong. I modify, resend. Information 137 is still wrong. Mm-hmm. That's awful. But nobody does that. You always return all possible error in one shot. So a good error feedback will be an error feedback that first is exhaustive. You describe all the problems and not one by one. And for each problem, whenever possible, you give hints, you give information about what is the problem and how to solve it. That's really important. And that way, that's also a good way to help people learn how to use your API. Because you can start from scratch. Okay, I see that this API is a post-brewing stuff. I can start without sending anything. I don't have to read the documentation after post/brewings. And that way, just by relying on the error feedback, I can learn how to use this operation because it will tell me, oh, you are missing this, and that, and you need to provide that information. Mm-hmm. And I didn't did that here, but you can look at, for instance, the GitHub APIs. When there is an error, they are returning in the error data, they are returning a URL of the documentation of the operation you are trying to use. That's a way of integrating documentation in your API design and in your API response. And so you are creating a really good experience with that.
Yeah, this is actually so interesting because it talks about, especially when it comes to writing errors, a lot of times people, you can provide that it doesn't work, but writing consistent errors all is about the right user experience for the person. So this is very interesting. I don't know if you wanted to show this, Arnaud, but within the design where you've designed this error, do you want to showcase like what that looks like at all? Like in the definition?
Yes, we can. Just let me get the final version of the API. So we go back from collection to the API tab, and I'm back in the coffee brewing API. And so I've added the errors. So if we go there, so now we have the 400, it appears, with an example. And we have the definition of our API. And so when there is a 400 errors, I explain, okay, we are returning errors, which is an object composed of a single property named errors, which is required. In a sense, you will, if you get a 400, you will always get that errors property, and it will always contain at least one element. And the list of error is composed of different elements and blah, blah, blah. And so with the description, so I have different types of generic errors. Again, I always try to categorize my errors with generic types, if possible. It's not always possible depending on the use case you are working with. So, but try to do that because that way it will be easier for consumers, and it will also help you to design, let's say, more simpler API. Because if you have hundreds types of different errors, you may have an issue with your design. And as you can see, I'm leveraging the description of my interface of the OpenAPI definition, so I can explain what is the purpose of each property. If you are working with private APIs, I always taught people, because sometimes you don't have too much time to spend on documentation. Just describe property that actually needs to be described. Because, for instance, if we have the bean, milk, it's the milk that goes into the coffee, you don't need to explain that. If that was a public API, you will explain it because that's expected. But for a private, just explain what is really, really important. Interesting thing regarding the descriptions in OpenAPI, and to provide more information to developers, you can put Markdown in your description. And so here I have a link to the specification of JSON pointers.
Yep. I think just to keep a little track on
Yeah.
time, since we have about 3 minutes left, I know that a lot of people have been asking questions about API versioning. So I think we're going to answer that last question. I think there's
Yeah.
been multiple questions. I think we
Yeah.
had some questions from Stephen and some other people.
I've briefly
about
seen
that.
some message regarding
Mhm.
the versioning of the API and the presence of V1 here.
Mhm.
So regarding versioning of API is about identifying a specific version of your API, but also managing change, managing evolutions of your API. And the real problem is not versioning, but how you will handle change and how you will represent that your API has changed, especially if it has changed in a non-backward compatible way. So to do so, there are different strategies about where to put the information of the version of your API and so on. There are heated debate on the topic. I personally use the good old ways of doing things. I put the major version of the number of the API in the path of my API. So the base path of the coffee brewing API is /coffeebrewing/v1. That way, if on my API gateway, I need to expose the version 2 of the API along with the version 1, because version 2 is non-backward compatible, and I need all consumers to be able to use V1, then migrate to V2, because I cannot synchronize with all of them, I can do that. There are other people like Stripe, for instance, who are able to take any API call from any version with the same backend, because they know, oh, this consumer is actually using the version from 10 years ago. And the implementation is able to take that old request, turn it into a new request, process it, transform the response, which is the new response, in the old format. Mm-hmm. So there are really two different topics. How do you represent and manage the versioning, and how do you manage change? So what is really important is to always carefully ponder the introduction of non-backward compatible change in your API. And you will be able to know if it's really a problem depending on the number of consumers of your API and how far they are from you. If there is one consumer, which is you can break your API every day, not a big issue. If there are many consumers, which are other teams in your organization, that's less complicated. But if there are many consumers who are in the outside world, you will not be able to break your API. I hope that answered the question. If you are over concerned regarding versioning or other question that we didn't answer today, you can ping me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I'll be happy to help you.
Awesome. Yeah. So I know we're all pretty much out of time for today, but we went through quite a bit, and I'm going to go ahead and continue to share my screen just to wrap up for today. For those of you who were interested in following along and wanted to kind of get more details about the API that we created. This is the coffee brewing API and its collection. And this is the definition file. So you can see a little bit more how it is designed. And, we have some really in-depth comments exactly of how this API is designed. So I believe I posted that link in the chat. So feel free to take a look at that and the public Postman Intergalactic workspace. We also have lots of additional resources for you all. So Intergalactic is a session where, we like to teach and, share all of our information. So if you want to stay up to date about Intergalactic, I'm going to be posting some links in the chat that you can take a look at when it comes to resources. Lots of different links where 30 days of Postman. We also have our community forum and also the Postman learning site as well. So that's something that you can also take a look at as well. And then finally, I hope this session kind of gives you a better understanding of the traits of effective API design, the reasons and impacts for both good and bad experiences when it comes to working with users, some better practices, especially when it comes to error handling, and just overall design principles as well. And if you enjoyed this session, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to learn a little bit more from your experience as well. So feel free to take this survey and learn a little bit and share with us your thoughts as well. So be sure to take the survey, and we'll take that into account. So I think this was a really insightful session. Arnaud, what do you think overall? Did you have fun?
Insightful. Yeah, it was fun, and I hope it was fun for you all too. Very good question. I see that there are many questions we didn't answer, and I will get the list too before we answer them in various ways. It was really interesting to leverage collections to demonstrate the impact of the design of your errors. I hope I will be able to do more sessions like this, leveraging that kind of Postman elements, because that's really interesting and very fun to create.
Definitely. Amazing. Yeah. So feel free to give us some information when it comes to working, getting insight, and then definitely check out some more resources from us as well. So thank you, everyone. I think this is all that we have for today. We've had a great session, and I hope that you've learned something new. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great, wonderful day. Bye-bye. Bye.